Welcome to a chapter a day. Before we begin, I want you to notice something strange. Right now, at this exact moment, your life feels completely real. Your problems feel real. Your responsibilities feel real. Your routines feel real. But what if I told you that most of what you call my life is actually a pattern your mind learned to repeat? Not fate, not destiny, a pattern. Think about this for a second. There was a time in your life when the person you are today did not exist. Your current fears didn't exist. Your habits didn't exist. Your limits didn't exist. They were built, quietly, one thought at a time, one reaction at a time, one interpretation at a time. And eventually, those tiny moments stacked together until they formed something powerful, an identity. And once the mind builds an identity, it begins defending it, even if that identity keeps you small, even if it keeps you stuck, even if somewhere deep inside you, you already know you're capable of more. Now here's the part almost nobody realizes. Your life does not follow your goals. Your life follows your identity. An identity is not permanent. It is programmable, which means something extraordinary becomes possible. If identity can be built, it can also be rebuilt. And when identity shifts, reality begins to reorganize around it. New decisions appear. New opportunities appear. New behaviors feel natural. It's not magic. It's alignment. Over the next few hours, something subtle is going to happen. You're going to start noticing patterns in your thinking that you've never seen before. You're going to recognize invisible forces that have been quietly shaping your choices. And at a certain moment, a moment many listeners describe as a kind of internal click, something shifts. You stop seeing yourself as the person reacting to life, and start seeing yourself as the person shaping it, not through force, through frequency, through awareness, through identity. So don't just listen to the words that follow. Listen to what happens inside your mind while you hear them. Because the moment a person begins to see their own patterns, they begin stepping outside them. And that is the moment a different life becomes possible. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The pattern running your life. You didn't choose it. The invisible routine did. Let's start with something simple. Think about how your day usually begins. Not the ideal morning you imagine when you think about productivity, but the real one, the one that actually happens. Your alarm goes off. Maybe you hit snooze once, maybe twice. Your eyes open, and almost immediately your mind begins running through familiar thoughts. Things you need to do, things you forgot yesterday, things you're slightly worried about. And before your day has even fully begun, your mind has already stepped into a pattern it knows well. Then something almost automatic happens. Your hand reaches for your phone. You check messages, notifications, maybe email, maybe social media. Within minutes, your attention has already been pulled into other people's worlds, other people's expectations, other people's opinions. And here's the strange part. You probably didn't consciously decide to do any of that. It simply happened, almost like a script your brain already knew. And this is where something important begins to reveal itself. Because the way most people live their lives isn't through deliberate choice. It's through repetition. The same reactions, the same emotional patterns, the same assumptions about what today will look like. Which leads to a powerful realization. Most lives are not designed. They are repeated. This is the moment to recognize the pattern. You may not have noticed this before, but if you look closely, patterns are everywhere in human behavior. Think about your last week. Certain thoughts probably appeared again and again. Certain emotional reactions repeated themselves. Certain habits happened almost without thinking. You might have had moments where you said to yourself, I should really change that. But then somehow, the next day looked very similar to the previous one. And this isn't because people are lazy. It's because the brain is efficient. In fact, the brain loves patterns. Patterns save energy. Patterns create predictability. Patterns help the mind move through life without having to constantly analyze every decision, which sounds helpful, and often it is. But there's another side to this system that most people never fully realize. Because the same mechanism that helps us function efficiently also quietly locks us into repeating the same version of ourselves, day after day, week after week, year after year, without ever intentionally choosing it. Pause for a moment and imagine something. Imagine watching a recording of your typical day from the outside. Not a highlight reel, just the normal version. You waking up, moving through your routines, responding to situations, making decisions, reacting emotionally. Now ask yourself something honestly. How much of that day was consciously designed by you? And how much of it was simply familiar behavior playing out again? Because here's something fascinating about the human mind. It often feels like we are actively directing our lives, when in reality we are mostly continuing patterns that were set long ago. Patterns learned from past experiences. Patterns learned from environments. Patterns learned from expectations we absorbed over time. And eventually, those patterns form something powerful, an identity. Now here's where things become truly interesting. Your brain has a very specific job. Its primary goal is not happiness. It's not success. It's not even fulfillment. Your brain's primary goal is stability. And one of the ways it creates stability is by protecting the identity it believes you are. Once the brain learns a version of you, it begins defending it, quietly, automatically. If your identity has been shaped around caution, the brain protects that caution. If your identity has been shaped around doubt, the brain protects that doubt. If your identity has been shaped around limitation, the brain protects those limitations too. Not because it wants you to struggle, but because familiarity feels safe. Even when familiarity is small, even when familiarity is frustrating, even when familiarity quietly prevents you from growing. And this leads to a realization that can feel surprising at first. Many people believe they are stuck because of circumstances, but very often, they are simply repeating a familiar identity. This means something powerful. Your life may not be limited by the opportunities available to you. Your life may be limited by the version of yourself your mind has learned to maintain. Think about that carefully, because it changes how we interpret almost everything. When someone hesitates to pursue an opportunity, it might not be about ability. It might be about identity. When someone repeatedly delays a decision, it might not be about motivation. It might be about familiarity. When someone stays in patterns that no longer serve them, it might not be about circumstances. It might be about the mind protecting a version of them that feels known. And this realization begins opening the door to something new. Because if identity shapes patterns, and patterns shape outcomes, then transformation does not begin with external change. It begins with awareness. Pause for a moment and think about this question. How many of the decisions you made today were truly intentional? Not automatic, not habitual, not expected, intentional. Most people are surprised by their own answer, because once you start observing your thinking, you begin noticing how much of life happens on autopilot. And the moment you notice a pattern, something interesting happens. You create a small amount of space between yourself and the pattern. And in that space, choice begins to appear. This is where the first real shift begins. Not through massive change, not through forcing yourself into an entirely different life overnight, but through something much simpler. Observation. The next time you notice yourself reacting automatically, pause. Just for a moment. Notice the reaction. Notice the thought. Notice the emotion. Without judging it. Without trying to suppress it. Just observe it. Because here's something strange about awareness. The moment you can clearly see a pattern, you are no longer completely controlled by it. Observation weakens automation. Awareness interrupts repetition, and slowly, almost quietly, the mind begins learning something new. That patterns are not permanent. They are adjustable. Over time, these small moments of awareness begin creating something powerful, a new relationship with your own mind. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin noticing the reactions. Instead of repeating the same identity, you begin questioning it. And when that happens, your choices begin to shift, not dramatically at first, but subtly. And those subtle shifts begin creating new patterns, new decisions, new behaviors, new possibilities. Eventually, something remarkable begins happening. Your life starts reflecting a different version of you, not because the world changed overnight, but because the identity guiding your choices began evolving. And this is the moment many people discover something extraordinary. The biggest limits in life are rarely external. They are patterns that went unquestioned for too long. Patterns that once served a purpose, but quietly continued running long after that purpose had passed. The good news is this: patterns can change. Identities can evolve. And awareness is where that process begins. But here's the truly fascinating part. Patterns don't just shape behavior. They shape something much bigger. Something most people never fully notice. The reality they experience. Because once you begin noticing patterns in your thinking, you start noticing something else as well. Your thoughts create emotional states. Those emotional states influence your perception. And perception quietly changes how you interact with the world. Which raises a fascinating question. What if your mind is doing more than simply interpreting reality? What if it is broadcasting a signal that influences the reality you experience? You've begun to see the pattern running your life. Now it's time to explore something even deeper. Chapter 2. Your mind is broadcasting a signal. This is classified as the emotional weather of your mind. Let's begin with something you've probably experienced many times before. You wake up one morning, and everything feels slightly heavy. Nothing terrible has happened. Nothing dramatic has changed. But your mind feels cloudy. Maybe you're a little tired. Maybe something small annoyed you the day before. And without even realizing it, that subtle emotional tone begins shaping your day. Small inconveniences feel bigger than usual. Conversations feel slightly tense. Problems seem more noticeable. Then there are other days. Days when you wake up feeling clear, energized, optimistic. And suddenly the exact same world feels different. The same commute feels lighter. The same work feels manageable. The same challenges feel almost interesting instead of overwhelming. Now pause for a moment and consider something carefully. The external world on those 2 days might be nearly identical. The same people. The same responsibilities, the same environment, and yet your experience of it feels completely different. Why? Because the emotional state you begin the day with quietly changes the way your mind interprets everything that follows. And this is where we begin uncovering something subtle but powerful. Your emotional state is not just reacting to your environment. It is shaping how you see it. Think about the last time you said something like this. Everything is going wrong today. Or maybe the opposite. Everything is working out today. Now, if we looked at those 2 days objectively, they probably weren't dramatically different. But once the mind enters a particular emotional state, something interesting begins happening. It starts searching for evidence that supports that feeling. If you're frustrated, your mind begins noticing more things to be frustrated about. If you're optimistic, your mind begins noticing more possibilities. In other words, your perception begins organizing itself around your emotional frequency. And this happens so naturally that most people never question it. They simply assume the world itself has changed. But something else is happening behind the scenes. Something much more interesting. Your mind is not just observing reality. It is filtering it. Every moment, your brain receives an overwhelming amount of information. Sounds, images, conversations, possibilities, but it cannot process everything. So it does something remarkable. It filters. It highlights certain details while ignoring others. It focuses your attention in specific directions. And the filter it uses is heavily influenced by two things: your thoughts and your emotional state. Together, they form something we might call a perceptual frequency, a mental lens through which the world is interpreted. And once that lens is active, your brain begins selecting experiences that match it, which leads to a fascinating possibility. What if reality is not experienced exactly as it is, but rather as it is filtered through your internal state? Most people grow up believing reality is a fixed structure, a solid external world that simply exists and that we react to. But when you begin studying how perception actually works, a different picture emerges. Reality begins to look less like a rigid structure and more like a mirror reflecting the mental and emotional patterns we bring into each moment. This doesn't mean we magically control everything that happens around us, but it does mean something important. The way we experience life is deeply influenced by the internal signals we maintain. Two people can walk into the same room. One notices opportunities. The other notices problems. One sees possibility. The other sees risk. The environment is the same, but the experience is different, because the mind is selecting what it believes matters, and the signal guiding that selection comes from within. Let's try something simple. Think back to a moment in your life when you felt extremely confident. Maybe you had just succeeded at something meaningful. Maybe someone believed in you. Maybe you had prepared deeply for an opportunity. In that state of mind, notice how your perception changes. You speak more clearly. You notice opportunities faster. You take action with less hesitation. Now think about the opposite state, a moment when you felt doubtful, uncertain, maybe slightly discouraged. In that state, your perception shifts in the opposite direction. You notice obstacles first. You hesitate longer. You question your decisions. The world appears different. But what actually changed? The external world, or the internal frequency through which you were experiencing it? This is one of the most important insights in understanding how human behavior works. Your experience of reality is deeply shaped by the signal your mind is broadcasting. Pause for a moment and reflect on the last week of your life. Not the major events, just the emotional tone you carried most often. Was it stress? Optimism? Frustration? Curiosity? Think carefully about this, because whatever emotional frequency you repeated most often likely influenced the kinds of experiences you noticed, the conversations you had, the decisions you made, the opportunities you recognized. And once you start observing this pattern, something remarkable begins happening. You begin realizing that your internal state is not just responding to life. It is participating in shaping how life unfolds. Now here is where things connect back to something we explored earlier. If emotional frequency influences perception, and perception influences decisions, then something deeper must determine which emotional states we repeat most often. Because people tend to return to familiar emotional patterns. Some individuals naturally lean toward curiosity, others toward caution, some toward optimism, others toward skepticism. And those tendencies are rarely random. They are connected to identity, the story the mind believes about who you are, which means the emotional frequency you maintain most often is often the emotional frequency your identity feels most comfortable with. And this leads us to a phrase you'll hear repeated throughout this journey, because it captures a powerful truth about how life unfolds. Your external world reflects the internal frequency you maintain, not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently over time. When people begin realizing this, something interesting happens. They stop trying to control every external circumstance, and they begin paying attention to the signal they are broadcasting internally. They start noticing their thoughts, their emotional patterns, their reactions, because those internal signals influence how they move through the world. And as those signals shift, their perception begins changing. They notice different opportunities. They make different decisions. They move with a different level of confidence. Eventually, the external results begin changing as well. Not because reality suddenly transformed overnight, but because the person interacting with reality did. This is where the deeper transformation begins. Many people spend their lives trying to rearrange external circumstances, trying to force outcomes, trying to control every variable. But when you understand how perception works, a different strategy begins emerging. Instead of obsessing over the external world, you begin working with the internal signal guiding your experience. Because the frequency of your thinking, the emotional tone you carry, the identity you reinforce, all influence the way life unfolds around you. And once that becomes clear, a quiet sense of power begins to return. Not the power of control, but the power of alignment. However, there's something even more fascinating about this process. Because frequency alone does not explain everything. Not everyone maintains the same emotional states. Not everyone repeats the same mental patterns. Something deeper determines which frequency your mind returns to again and again. Something we briefly touched on earlier, but haven't fully explored yet. Your identity. The version of yourself your mind believes you are. And once we understand how identity operates, we begin seeing why some people naturally move toward growth, while others unconsciously resist it. You've begun to see how your mind filters reality. You've begun to see how emotional frequency shapes perception. And you've started recognizing that the internal signal you maintain influences the experiences you notice and pursue. But this raises an even deeper question. If your emotional frequency shapes your perception, what determines the emotional frequency you repeat most often? The answer lies in something powerful, something the mind protects with incredible intensity. Your identity, the version of yourself your brain has learned to defend. And understanding that mechanism changes everything. Because the moment you begin questioning the identity your mind is protecting, you begin opening the door to an entirely different life. So now it's time to explore that hidden force. Chapter 3. The identity your mind is protecting. Explore this scenario with me. 2 people, 1 opportunity. Imagine 2 people walking into the same room. The same lighting. The same opportunity. The same moment that could change everything. Maybe it's a job interview. Maybe it's a business pitch. Maybe it's the moment someone asks, "Do you want to lead this project?" To an outside observer, the situation is identical for both people. Same chance, same reward, same potential outcome. But inside their minds, something very different is happening. The first person feels a quiet tension rise in their chest, a subtle hesitation. Their thoughts begin whispering questions. What if I'm not ready? What if I fail? What if they realize I'm not as capable as they think? Their body tightens. Their voice becomes careful. And eventually they step back. Not dramatically, just enough to avoid fully stepping forward. Now look at the second person. Same room, same opportunity. But inside their mind, the experience is completely different. They feel curiosity instead of hesitation. Their thoughts sound like this. This could be interesting. Let's see what happens. I'll figure it out. Their body opens. Their voice carries certainty. And they step forward. Not perfectly, but confidently enough to move. From the outside, it might look like one person is simply more confident, or more talented, or more prepared. But the real difference is much deeper than skill. The real difference is identity. Because every opportunity you encounter must pass through a hidden filter inside your mind. And that filter asks a simple question. Is this compatible with who I believe I am? If the answer is yes, your brain moves you toward it. If the answer is no, your brain quietly pulls you away. Not to harm you, but to protect something it believes is essential. Consistency. The brain is loyalty to identity. Your brain has a powerful priority, more powerful than success, more powerful than comfort, more powerful even than happiness. That priority is identity stability. Your brain wants your experience of yourself to remain consistent, predictable, familiar, because familiarity feels safe. Think about how this works in everyday life. If someone believes they are bad with money, they will unconsciously make financial decisions that reinforce that belief. If someone believes they are unlucky, they will notice evidence that confirms that story. If someone believes they are not the kind of person who takes risks, they will feel discomfort the moment risk appears. Not because the risk is dangerous, but because it threatens the identity they've been protecting. This is why two people can read the same book, hear the same advice, see the same opportunity, and produce completely different results. One person integrates the information, the other person resists it, not consciously, subconsciously, because the advice challenges the identity they've built. And your brain treats identity threats the same way it treats physical threats, with resistance, with hesitation, with doubt. This is the moment where many people experience a surprising realization. People rarely fail because they lack ability. They fail because success contradicts the identity they believe about themselves. A person who secretly believes they are not worthy of success will sabotage progress. A person who believes they are invisible will struggle to speak up. A person who believes they are always behind will rush through life trying to catch up. The behavior makes sense once you understand the identity behind it. And once you see this clearly, something important becomes possible. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What identity is my brain protecting?" Because once you see the identity, you begin to see the pattern. Here is how the loop works. First, something happens in your life. A moment of criticism, a moment of embarrassment, a moment where you felt small or uncertain. Your brain interprets the moment. It creates a story. Maybe the story sounds like, "I'm not good at this," or "People like me don't succeed at things like that," or "I'm not the confident type." At first, the story is just a thought, but the brain repeats it, and repetition turns thoughts into beliefs. Beliefs turn into expectations. Expectations shape behavior. Behavior creates results, and those results appear to confirm the original belief. This is the identity loop. Thought, belief, behavior, evidence, reinforced identity. And once that loop stabilizes, your brain begins protecting it, even when the identity limits your life, even when the identity no longer fits the person you could become. Because from the brain's perspective, certainty feels safer than possibility. Now let's pause for a moment, not to analyze the world, but to observe yourself. Think about the last few days of your life, the decisions you made, the moments when you spoke up or stayed quiet, the opportunities you moved toward or stepped away from. Now ask yourself a deeper question, not what you did, but why it felt natural to do it. Because behavior that repeats usually belongs to an identity. And identities are often revealed through the quiet sentences we tell ourselves. I'm the kind of person who. Finish that sentence in your mind. I'm the kind of person who works best under pressure, avoids conflict, always overthinks, struggles with discipline, needs more time before taking action. Whatever phrase comes to mind, that sentence may be describing the identity your brain has been protecting. Now here's the reflection that changes everything. Pause for a moment. Who do you believe you are when no one else is watching? Not the role you play at work, not the version of yourself you present online, but the internal version, the one that speaks in your private thoughts, the one that reacts automatically, because that identity is quietly shaping your life. Every day, every decision, every opportunity, the first shift is awareness. The moment you recognize an identity pattern, something subtle begins to change, because awareness creates distance. Instead of saying, "This is just who I am," you begin saying, "This is a pattern I learned." And those two perspectives are very different. One feels permanent, the other feels changeable. The first traps you, the second frees you, because identity is not something you were born with. It is something your brain constructed from past experiences. And anything constructed can be reconstructed. But before we talk about how identity changes, there is something even more surprising you need to understand. Identity is not just shaping your behavior. It is shaping your perception of reality itself. Think back to the two people who walked into the same opportunity. One hesitated, one acted. At first glance, it looked like confidence versus fear. But now you see something deeper. Each person was acting in alignment with the identity their brain was protecting. One identity said, "This isn't who I am." The other identity said, "This is exactly who I am." And the world responded accordingly. This realization connects to the central idea running through this entire book. Your life is not just shaped by what you do. It is shaped by who your mind believes you are. Change the identity, and behavior changes. Change behavior, and outcomes change. Change outcomes, and eventually, reality begins to reorganize around the new version of you. But identity itself is not permanent. It is something the brain learns, and anything learned can be changed. So now we arrive at the deeper question. If identity is learned, who taught it to you? Where did it come from? And why do certain beliefs about yourself feel so convincing, even when they limit your life? Because long before you began protecting your identity, your mind was absorbing signals from the world around you. Signals that quietly shaped the story of who you believed yourself to be. Understanding those signals is the next step in reclaiming control of your identity. And once you see them clearly, you'll begin to understand how powerful your mind truly is. You've seen the identity your mind has been protecting. Now let's discover where that identity was first written. Chapter 4: The Familiarity Trap. The invisible pull of familiarity. Think about the last few years of your life. Not the big moments, not the milestones, the patterns, the kinds of situations that seem to appear again and again. Maybe it shows up in relationships. You meet someone new. At first, everything feels exciting, different, refreshing. But after a while, the emotional atmosphere begins to feel strangely familiar. The same misunderstandings, the same arguments, the same emotional distance. Different person, same dynamic. Or maybe it appears in your financial life. You make progress. You save money. You build momentum. And then somehow something happens. An unexpected expense. A risky decision. A sudden drop in motivation. And before long, you find yourself back in a situation that feels oddly familiar. Not identical, but recognizable. Or maybe the pattern shows up in confidence. You have moments when you feel capable, focused, clear about what you want, and then something subtle shifts. A doubt appears, a hesitation creeps in, and suddenly you're back in the mental space you visited so many times before. Second-guessing, holding back, waiting for the right moment. When you begin to look closely, you may notice something surprising. Life often feels like it moves in circles. Not perfect circles, but emotional patterns that repeat with remarkable consistency. And when these patterns repeat long enough, people often reach the same conclusion. This is just how my life works. But that explanation is incomplete, because the real force behind these patterns is not luck. And it's not coincidence. It's familiarity. Most people believe their comfort zone is defined by comfort. They imagine it as a place where things feel easy, relaxed, safe. But that's not actually how the brain defines it. Your brain does not prioritize comfort. It prioritizes familiarity. And familiarity does not always feel good. Sometimes familiarity feels stressful. Sometimes it feels frustrating. Sometimes it feels disappointing. But if it's familiar, your brain understands it. It knows how to navigate it. And understanding feels safer than uncertainty. This leads to one of the most surprising psychological truths about human behavior. Your comfort zone is not about comfort. It's about familiarity, which means something unexpected begins to happen. People unconsciously recreate emotional environments they already understand, even when those environments limit them, even when those environments hurt them, because the brain prefers predictable problems over unfamiliar opportunities. Imagine someone who grew up in an environment where criticism was common, where praise was rare, where mistakes were quickly pointed out. Over time, their mind becomes familiar with that emotional climate. Now imagine that person enters a new environment where people are supportive, encouraging, patient. At first, it feels good, but something inside them may also feel strangely uneasy. Not because encouragement is bad, but because encouragement is unfamiliar. The brain starts searching for something it recognizes, and eventually, the person may unconsciously recreate the emotional pattern they understand. They might become overly self-critical. They might misinterpret feedback. They might withdraw from situations where success feels possible, not intentionally, but automatically, because the brain is trying to return to a familiar emotional state. This same mechanism appears everywhere in life, in relationships, in careers, in financial behavior, in confidence. Familiarity becomes the invisible gravity pulling experiences back toward patterns the brain understands. And once you see this clearly, a powerful realization begins to emerge. Your life may not be repeating because the world is limiting you. It may be repeating because your mind is recreating familiar emotional environments. Here's how this loop quietly operates. First, you experience a certain emotional pattern often enough that it becomes familiar. Maybe it's pressure. Maybe it's uncertainty. Maybe it's feeling overlooked. Over time, your brain begins to recognize that emotional state as normal. Then something interesting happens. Your perception begins filtering reality through that expectation. You notice things that confirm the pattern. You overlook things that contradict it. Eventually, your behavior begins aligning with the expectation. And your behavior helps recreate the emotional experience your brain already understands. The result, the pattern repeats. Not because the world demanded it, but because familiarity quietly guided your perception and behavior. This is why two people can experience the same environment and interpret it completely differently. One person sees opportunity. Another sees risk. One person hears feedback. Another hears criticism. One person sees possibility. Another sees proof that things won't work. The external environment may be identical, but the internal pattern changes how reality appears. And once again, the loop continues. Now let's slow down for a moment, not to analyze the world, but to observe your own patterns. Think about situations in your life that feel strangely repetitive. Maybe it's a particular emotional reaction, a moment when you suddenly feel discouraged, a moment when you begin doubting yourself, a moment when motivation disappears. Now ask yourself something important. Not why it happened, but how familiar it feels. Does the emotional reaction feel new? Or does it feel like something you've experienced many times before? Because repetition often signals a pattern your brain recognizes. And patterns reveal something deeper than behavior. They reveal identity. Here is a phrase you will hear repeated throughout this audiobook. Patterns reveal the identity you've been living from. If discouragement appears often, there may be an identity that expects struggle. If hesitation appears often, there may be an identity that questions readiness. If pressure appears often, there may be an identity that believes success requires constant tension. Patterns are not random. They are clues. Clues pointing toward the version of yourself your mind has been reinforcing. So over the next few days, try something simple. Observe your emotional reactions as if you were studying a pattern, not judging them, not trying to fix them immediately, just noticing them. When frustration appears, notice it. When hesitation appears, notice it. When doubt appears, notice it. Because the moment you can see a pattern clearly, you begin stepping outside it. This is the quiet power of awareness. Many people believe transformation begins with dramatic action, huge decisions, massive changes, bold declarations. But real transformation often begins with something much quieter. Awareness. Awareness changes how you interpret your own experience. Instead of saying, "This always happens to me," you begin saying, "I've seen this pattern before." That subtle shift matters. Because patterns that are invisible feel permanent. Patterns that are visible feel changeable. And the moment a pattern becomes visible, you regain a small but powerful degree of freedom. You can pause. You can question the reaction. You can choose a slightly different response. It may feel small at first, but small shifts repeated over time begin reshaping identity. And identity reshapes behavior. Behavior reshapes outcomes, which means awareness is the first doorway to change. But awareness alone is not the full story. Because recognizing a pattern doesn't automatically dissolve it. Seeing the loop doesn't immediately break the loop. Something else is required. Something deeper. Alignment. Throughout this chapter, you've seen how powerful familiarity can be. Not just in habits, but in emotional environments. The brain naturally gravitates toward experiences it understands, even when those experiences limit growth. Even when those experiences keep life repeating familiar cycles. But now you've begun noticing something important. Those cycles are not random. They are signals. Signals revealing the identity your mind has been protecting. And that realization brings us back to the central theme of this entire book. Your life is not just shaped by the events around you. It is shaped by the patterns within you. The patterns of thought. The patterns of emotion, the patterns of identity. Change those patterns, and the direction of your life begins to shift. But recognizing a pattern is only the beginning, because awareness alone doesn't change reality. Alignment does. Now that you've begun noticing the patterns your mind repeats, a deeper question emerges. What happens when your thoughts, your emotions, and your identity begin moving in the same direction? What happens when your inner state stops fighting itself? Because when alignment appears, something remarkable happens. Decisions become clearer. Energy becomes focused. And the life you experience begins reflecting the state you maintain within. You've seen the patterns. Now it's time to understand how to bring your inner world into alignment. Chapter 5: Alignment, the force that changes outcomes. Here's another scenario. Two paths toward the same goal. Imagine two people pursuing the same goal. They both want to improve their lives. Maybe it's building a business. Maybe it's improving their health. Maybe it's finally stepping into a version of themselves they've been thinking about for years. From the outside, their journeys look similar. Both read books. Both listen to podcasts. Both set goals and make plans. Both wake up each day determined to make progress. But over time, something very different begins to happen. The first person feels like they are constantly pushing against resistance. Every step forward requires enormous effort. Motivation comes and goes. Doubt appears frequently. They start projects with excitement, but finishing them feels exhausting. Their progress feels slow, heavy, uncertain. Now look at the second person. They are working just as hard, sometimes even harder, but their experience feels completely different. They feel momentum. Their decisions feel clear. Their energy feels focused. When obstacles appear, they adapt quickly and continue moving forward. Instead of forcing progress, it feels like progress begins to pull them. To an observer, this difference can be confusing. Both people are intelligent. Both people are capable. Both people are trying. So why does one path feel like constant struggle, while the other begins to feel like flow? The answer often has very little to do with effort, and everything to do with alignment. Here lies the hidden force behind momentum. Alignment is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, but it's rarely discussed directly. Most people focus on motivation, or discipline, or strategy, but beneath all of those things lies something more fundamental: alignment. Alignment happens when three internal forces begin moving in the same direction: your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions. When these three forces support each other, something powerful occurs. Energy stops being wasted on internal conflict. Focus sharpens. Momentum builds. But when these forces move in different directions, the opposite happens. You experience resistance. Imagine someone who says they want to succeed in their career. Their actions might reflect that desire. They work long hours. They pursue opportunities. They try to move forward. But internally, something else may be happening. Their thoughts might sound like this: I'm not sure I'm ready. What if I fail? What if people expect more from me than I can deliver? At the same time, their emotions may be filled with tension, anxiety, hesitation. Now notice what happens. Their actions say move forward, but their thoughts whisper be careful. And their emotions signal this might not be safe. Three forces moving in three different directions. This creates friction. Internal friction drains energy. Internal friction slows progress. Internal friction turns simple decisions into exhausting battles, which leads to one of the most surprising truths about success. Effort without alignment creates resistance. This is why some people work incredibly hard, yet feel stuck, and why others seem to build momentum with surprising ease. The difference is not always effort. It's alignment. It's important to know what alignment feels like. When alignment begins to appear in someone's life, the change is noticeable. Not necessarily dramatic at first, but clear. Decisions begin to feel simpler. The constant internal debate quiets down. Instead of asking, should I really do this? The mind begins saying, this is where I'm going. Energy increases. Focus sharpens. The emotional state supporting action becomes stronger than the fear resisting it. This is the beginning of flow. Flow does not mean life becomes effortless. Challenges still appear. Obstacles still exist. But internally, the person is no longer divided. Their thoughts support their actions. Their emotions support their direction. And when that happens, effort becomes far more effective. Think of it like rowing a boat. If one oar pulls forward while the other pushes backward, the boat spins in circles, no matter how hard you row. But when both oars move in the same direction, the boat moves forward with surprising speed. Alignment works the same way. There's also an internal conflict that most people miss. Many people unknowingly live in a state of internal contradiction. They say they want confidence, but their thoughts repeat self-doubt. They say they want success, but their emotions associate success with pressure or fear. They say they want change, but their identity is still protecting the familiar version of themselves. This internal contradiction creates a quiet but powerful conflict. Part of the mind moves forward. Another part pulls back. The result feels like being stuck. But what's really happening is internal misalignment. The mind has not yet agreed on the direction, which means action feels heavier than it needs to. Once again, we return to the central idea running through this book. Your life is not just shaped by what you do. It is shaped by the internal state from which your actions emerge. When that state is divided, progress slows. When that state becomes aligned, momentum appears. When momentum appears, use the internal alignment practice to hold the alignment. Now let's pause and turn this insight into something practical. Because alignment is not something that happens accidentally. It's something you learn to notice and gradually cultivate. The first step is awareness. Every day, ask yourself a simple question. A question that quietly reveals alignment or conflict. Here it is. Do my thoughts support the life I say I want? Not the thoughts you wish you had. The thoughts that actually appear. If you say you want to build confidence, but your internal dialogue constantly questions your ability, that's misalignment. If you say you want success, but your emotional state is dominated by fear of responsibility, that's misalignment. If you say you want growth, but your identity still sees you as the same person you were years ago, that's misalignment. And again, the goal is not judgment. It's observation. Because once you see the misalignment clearly, something important becomes possible. You can begin adjusting the direction of your internal forces. Gradually, thought by thought, reaction by reaction, identity by identity. This is not instant transformation. It's internal calibration, a process of bringing thoughts, emotions, and actions into greater harmony. And when that harmony increases, life begins responding differently. Alignment changes the way you interpret challenges. Instead of seeing obstacles as proof you should stop, you see them as part of the path forward. Alignment changes the way you make decisions. Instead of constant hesitation, you experience clarity. Alignment changes the way others perceive you, because confidence often appears when internal conflict disappears. And perhaps most importantly, alignment changes how your brain processes opportunity. When thoughts, emotions, and actions move in the same direction, your mind becomes more receptive to possibilities that match that direction. You begin noticing solutions you previously overlooked. You recognize opportunities you might have ignored. Your perception begins working with your goals, instead of against them. This is the beginning of real momentum. Throughout this chapter, we explored something deeper than motivation, something deeper than discipline. Alignment, the state where your thoughts support your direction, your emotions reinforce your actions, and your identity begins evolving toward the life you want to create. When alignment appears, effort becomes more effective. Progress accelerates, and the internal resistance that once slowed you down begins to dissolve. Which brings us back to the central theme of this book. Your external world reflects the internal patterns you maintain. When those patterns are divided, life feels difficult. When those patterns become aligned, life begins to move. But alignment does something even more powerful inside the brain, something most people never realize. Because when alignment appears, your brain begins rewiring itself. Alignment is not just a psychological shift. It is also a biological one. When your thoughts, emotions, and actions begin moving in the same direction, your brain starts forming new neural patterns. Old identities weaken. New possibilities strengthen. And what once felt difficult slowly begins to feel natural. Understanding this process reveals how real transformation occurs. Not through force, but through the way your brain learns to adapt. You've seen how alignment changes outcomes. Now it's time to understand how your brain turns alignment into lasting change. Chapter 6. Why your brain resists the life you want. There's a curiosity gap, known as the hidden opposition inside your mind. At this point in the journey, a question naturally begins to appear. If people truly want a better life, if they genuinely want more confidence, more freedom, more success, then why do they so often resist the very changes that could create it? Why does someone decide to improve their health and then skip the habits that would make it happen? Why does someone say they want a new level of success and then hesitate when opportunities appear? Why does someone commit to growth only to slowly drift back toward the patterns they were trying to escape? From the outside, it can look like a lack of discipline, or motivation, or willpower. But beneath the surface, something much deeper is happening. Your brain is not designed primarily to make your life extraordinary. Your brain is designed to make your life predictable. Predictability creates stability. Stability creates safety. And safety is the brain's highest priority. This means something surprising begins to occur whenever you try to change your life. The moment you attempt to step outside the identity your brain recognizes, resistance appears. Not because your goal is impossible, not because your dream is unrealistic, but because your brain is trying to preserve something it believes is essential: your current identity. Think of your identity as the central story your brain tells about who you are. It might include beliefs like, I'm someone who struggles with discipline. I'm someone who overthinks. I'm someone who doesn't usually take big risks. These beliefs may not always be spoken out loud. Often they exist quietly beneath the surface of your thinking. But they are powerful, because your brain works constantly to keep your behavior consistent with that story. Why? Because consistency makes the world easier to understand, and the brain values understanding more than improvement. This leads to one of the most important realizations in personal transformation. Most self-help advice fails because it ignores identity protection. Advice often focuses on changing behavior. Work harder, wake up earlier, push through fear, take more action. But if those behaviors conflict with the identity your brain has been protecting, resistance appears immediately. The behavior feels unnatural, uncomfortable, almost like wearing clothes that don't quite fit, which is why people often start strong and then slowly return to their familiar patterns, not because they lack ambition, but because something inside their mind is defending the identity it recognizes. And this brings us to a phrase you will hear repeated often in this audiobook. The mind defends the person it believes you are. If the mind believes you are someone who avoids risk, it will generate hesitation. If the mind believes you are someone who struggles with discipline, it will generate procrastination. If the mind believes you are someone who stays in the background, it will generate self-doubt when attention appears. Again, none of this happens consciously. It happens automatically. The brain simply protects the identity it has learned. Resistance often feels frustrating. It can make people feel as though something is wrong with them. They set a goal. They feel excited. They begin moving forward. And then suddenly, progress slows. Energy drops. Focus fades. Doubt returns. But once you understand identity protection, resistance begins to look different. Resistance is not always an enemy. Sometimes it's simply a signal that the new behavior is challenging the identity your brain currently recognizes. Imagine someone who has always seen themselves as shy. For years, their identity has quietly repeated, I'm not the type of person who speaks confidently in front of others. Now imagine they decide to change. They sign up for a presentation, or they speak up in a meeting, or they begin sharing their ideas more openly. Immediately, resistance appears. Their heart beats faster. Their thoughts question the decision. Their mind searches for reasons to stop. This reaction might seem like fear, but at a deeper level, it's identity protection. The brain is reacting to behavior that contradicts the identity it believes is true. And because the brain prefers consistency, it tries to guide behavior back toward the familiar pattern. Understanding this changes how you interpret resistance. Instead of saying, why am I sabotaging myself? You begin asking, what identity is my brain trying to protect? That question reveals the real source of the conflict. Once you begin observing resistance carefully, you may notice a fascinating pattern. Resistance rarely appears randomly. It appears most strongly at the exact moments when your identity is about to expand. Right before speaking up, right before launching something new, right before stepping into unfamiliar responsibility. right before becoming a version of yourself that your brain has not yet fully accepted. Resistance often appears at the edge of growth. But without understanding identity protection, many people misinterpret this moment. They assume resistance means, "This must not be right for me," or "I'm not ready," or "I should wait until I feel more confident." So they step back. They return to familiar patterns, and the identity remains unchanged. But when you recognize resistance as identity protection, something remarkable happens. The experience becomes less intimidating. Instead of seeing resistance as proof you should stop, you begin seeing it as evidence that change is beginning. Now let's turn this insight into a practical reflection. The next time resistance appears in your life, pause for a moment. Instead of pushing it away, observe it. Notice the thoughts that appear. Notice the emotional reactions. Notice the stories your mind begins telling. You might hear sentences like, "This isn't the right time. What if it doesn't work? Maybe I should wait a little longer." These thoughts often feel convincing, but look beneath them. Ask yourself a deeper question. What identity is being protected right now? Is it the identity of someone who avoids risk? The identity of someone who plays small? The identity of someone who believes success belongs to other people? Because if resistance is appearing, there is a strong possibility that a familiar identity is being challenged. And this leads to a powerful reflection, one that reveals the doorway to transformation. Pause for a moment and consider this question carefully. What identity would have to change for your next level of life to feel normal? Not exciting, not intimidating, normal. Because when a new identity becomes normal, behavior changes naturally. Opportunities feel less threatening. Growth feels less dramatic. Progress feels sustainable. Identity change is what makes transformation last. At this point in the journey, something important begins shifting in your perspective. Instead of fighting your mind, you begin studying it. Instead of forcing yourself through resistance, you begin understanding the identity behind it. Instead of assuming change is impossible, you begin seeing the psychological patterns shaping your experience. And with that awareness comes something powerful. Freedom. Not instant transformation, but the freedom to question the stories your brain has been repeating. The freedom to see resistance for what it really is. And the freedom to gradually evolve the identity guiding your life. Because identity is not fixed. It is learned. And anything learned can eventually be changed. Throughout this chapter, we explored a hidden force shaping human behavior. The brain's desire to protect identity stability. Your mind is constantly working to keep your actions consistent with the person it believes you are, which means growth often triggers resistance. Not because change is impossible, but because change challenges familiarity. And yet, once you understand this mechanism, resistance begins to look very different. It stops being a barrier and starts becoming a signal that your identity may be expanding. This insight connects directly to the deeper theme running through this entire book. Your life changes when the identity guiding your thoughts, emotions, and actions begins to evolve. Change the identity, and behavior follows. Change behavior, and your external reality begins to shift. But this leads to one of the most surprising discoveries about personal transformation. Because when identity begins to evolve, something strange happens to fear. And something even stranger happens to confidence. Most people believe confidence comes before action. They assume confident people simply feel ready, certain, fearless. But when you understand identity and resistance, a different truth begins to emerge. Confidence is not something you wait for. It's something your brain gradually learns. And the process of learning confidence is far more fascinating than most people realize. You've seen why your brain resists change. Now it's time to understand how confidence is actually built. Chapter 7. Confidence is a side effect, not a requirement. Now let's recognition pattern, the the confidence trap. There is a pattern that quietly holds millions of people in place. At first, it sounds logical, responsible, even wise. It sounds like this: I'll do it when I feel more confident. People say it about starting businesses, about pursuing creative work, about speaking in public, about changing careers, about introducing themselves to new opportunities. They wait for the right feeling. They wait for certainty. They wait for confidence. And sometimes they wait for years. The assumption behind this pattern is simple. Confidence must come first. Action comes second. But if you observe how real confidence actually develops, something surprising begins to appear. The sequence most people believe in is backwards. Confidence rarely appears before action. Confidence appears because of action. This misunderstanding keeps many people standing at the edge of the life they want, waiting for a feeling that can only develop after they move. And the longer they wait, the more distant that feeling seems to become. Which leads to an important realization. Confidence is not the starting point of change. It is the result of it. Try viewing the way reality works in reverse. Let's imagine someone preparing to do something unfamiliar. Perhaps they are about to give their first presentation, or launch their first project, or speak up in a room where they usually stay quiet. At that moment, their mind begins searching for a signal that says, "You're ready." But the brain rarely sends that signal before experience exists. Why? Because confidence is not an abstract emotion. Confidence is built from evidence. Your brain gathers small pieces of evidence over time. Moments where you tried something. Moments where you adapted. Moments where you survived uncertainty. Each experience becomes data. And that data slowly reshapes the identity your brain believes about you. But if no action occurs, no data is created, no evidence exists, which means the brain has nothing new to believe. So the old identity remains. The person keeps waiting for confidence. But confidence cannot appear because the evidence that creates it has not yet been produced. This is why growth often begins with a strange paradox. You must act before you feel ready. And once you act, the feeling you were waiting for begins to develop. This is the reverse nature of confidence. Action first, belief second, identity third. Mentally travel through the first step into momentum with me. Imagine pushing a large object across a floor. At first, the object barely moves. It feels heavy. Resistance is strong. The effort required feels disproportionate to the progress being made. But if you keep pushing, something interesting begins to happen. The object starts to move, slowly at first, then a little faster. Once momentum builds, each additional push becomes easier. Human behavior works in a similar way. The first action toward change often feels the most difficult, not because it requires extraordinary skill, but because it challenges the identity your brain has been protecting. The second action feels slightly easier, the third easier still. Momentum begins to build, and as momentum builds, something subtle shifts inside the mind. Your brain begins collecting new evidence. Evidence that contradicts the old identity. Evidence that says, maybe I am capable of this. Maybe this direction is possible. And with every new piece of evidence, belief grows stronger. This leads us to an important principle for personal transformation, the momentum principle. The momentum principle states that small actions repeated consistently reshape identity over time. You don't need massive breakthroughs to change how your brain sees you. You need consistent movement. Movement creates new experiences. New experiences create new evidence. New evidence reshapes belief. Belief reshapes identity. This process may feel slow at first, but over time it becomes powerful. A person who once believed they were incapable begins seeing themselves differently. A person who once avoided challenges begins engaging with them. A person who once hesitated begins stepping forward. not because they forced themselves to change, but because repeated action created a new internal narrative. And that narrative slowly replaced the old one. This is why one simple phrase appears throughout this audiobook. A phrase worth remembering. Movement creates belief. Not the other way around. Movement creates belief. Each step forward becomes a signal to the brain. Each signal reshapes the story your mind tells about who you are. And that story begins guiding your future behavior. When someone begins acting consistently in a new direction, the identity inside their mind begins evolving. At first, the change feels uncertain. The person may still feel like they are trying. They may still feel moments of doubt. But something else begins appearing alongside those doubts. Evidence. Evidence that they are capable of more than they previously believed. And with enough evidence, the internal story changes. Instead of saying, "I'm not confident," the mind begins saying, "I'm learning." Instead of saying, "I'm not ready," the mind begins saying, "I'm improving." These small shifts in internal language matter more than they might appear. Because identity is built from repeated interpretations. When interpretations change, identity follows. And when identity changes, behavior becomes easier to sustain. Confidence slowly emerges as a natural side effect. Not because someone waited for it, but because they created it through consistent movement. This is why confidence feels sudden. Many people describe confidence as if it appeared suddenly. One day they felt unsure. The next day they felt capable. But what looks like sudden transformation is usually the result of many small actions accumulating beneath the surface. Each action adds a small amount of evidence. At first, that evidence feels insignificant. But over time, it reaches a tipping point. The brain can no longer ignore the pattern. It recognizes the new identity forming. And once that happens, behavior begins aligning naturally with that identity. Confidence appears. Not because something magical happened overnight, but because the brain finally accepted the new story as believable. Throughout this chapter, we explored one of the most misunderstood aspects of personal growth. Confidence is not a prerequisite for action. It is the result of action. Waiting for confidence often keeps people standing still. But movement creates evidence. Evidence creates belief. And belief reshapes identity. This insight connects directly to the deeper theme running throughout this book. Your life changes when the internal patterns guiding your behavior begin to shift. Thought patterns, emotional patterns, identity patterns. When those patterns evolve, your actions naturally follow. And when your actions evolve, your reality begins to change. Confidence is simply one of the signals that the identity inside your mind is expanding. But action alone is not the final piece of the puzzle. Because something even more powerful influences the direction of your life. Something that quietly shapes how far your momentum can carry you. Action creates movement. Momentum builds belief. Belief reshapes identity. But there is another force guiding the path your life ultimately follows. A force that determines whether your momentum leads to growth or slowly fades away. Understanding this force reveals why some people continue evolving while others eventually return to old patterns. You've seen how action creates confidence. Now it's time to understand the deeper force that determines your trajectory. Chapter 8: Emotional Energy is a Creation Tool. The next pattern recognition is the hidden power of emotion. Pause for a moment and consider how you start your day. Do you wake up excited, curious, and energized? Or do you wake up tired, distracted, replaying yesterday's concerns in your mind? Here's what most people fail to realize. The emotional state you carry is not just a reaction. It's a tool. Your emotions act as a lens, coloring everything you notice and everything you attempt. A person moving through the world with hope and curiosity sees opportunities others miss. A person moving through the world with anxiety and fatigue misses even the most obvious chances. Think about it for a moment. Two people enter the same environment, the same meeting, the same conversation. One sees potential, solutions, and openings. The other sees obstacles, limitations, and risk. The difference? Their emotional energy. And the most important insight, this energy is something you can observe and shape. Use the emotion as a signal. Your brain does not just register emotion passively. It uses emotion as a signal that influences perception, choices, and action. High-energy emotional states, like excitement, joy, and confidence, act like a magnet, drawing your attention to opportunities that align with growth. Low-energy states, like fear, frustration, or resentment, act like a filter, shrinking your focus and keeping you locked into repetitive patterns. Shock reframing. Your emotional state is not just a reaction to reality. It is a signal shaping reality. Think about that. This is profound. It means that when you feel anger, sadness, or fatigue, your brain is not merely reporting a truth about the world. It is showing you what you are currently tuned into, and in turn, shaping the choices you are likely to make. Emotions don't just describe reality. They create a map for your perception of reality. Here's another scenario: how energy shapes outcomes. Let me illustrate. Two entrepreneurs receive the same potential business opportunity. The first is anxious, doubting their own abilities, and fixated on what might go wrong. They focus on risks. They notice flaws in the plan. They hesitate. The second is energized, curious, and focused on the possibilities. They notice potential gaps to fill, solutions to innovate, and allies to collaborate with. They take action immediately. Which person is more likely to succeed? It's not just their skills or knowledge. It's their emotional energy guiding their perception. This is the subtle but critical mechanism that most self-help programs miss. Here's something you can practice starting today called the emotional awareness practice. Observe your dominant emotional state each morning. Ask yourself, which emotion have I been rehearsing most often? Notice the effect it has on your choices, interactions, and energy throughout the day. Even a few minutes of awareness begins to retrain your brain. By noticing habitual emotional patterns, you start creating space to shift them. Then, the next step, deliberate emotional shaping. Use visualization, gratitude, and focus on expansive, high-energy feelings. Notice how your perception shifts, how your mind begins seeing opportunities you didn't notice before, how your body and voice change. This is the foundation of emotional creation. You are not at the mercy of your mood. You are beginning to steer it consciously. Pause for a moment. Consider the emotions you most frequently rehearse throughout your day. Do they reinforce the version of yourself that stays small, hesitant, or reactive? Or do they reinforce the version of yourself that steps forward, creates, and expands? Remember the theme repeated throughout this audiobook. Your life reflects the identity you protect and the energy you maintain. Emotions are one of the most immediate ways your identity expresses itself. The feelings you carry are echoes of the self you've been living as. By shifting energy, you shift identity. By shifting identity, you shift your outcomes. This is a profound, often overlooked law of personal transformation. And here is the most remarkable part. Once people learn to observe and intentionally shift their emotional energy, something begins to happen inside the brain. Not just minor improvements. Not just temporary boosts in motivation. Something systemic begins. Patterns of perception start to reorganize. Attention moves toward opportunity. The brain begins learning a new default. The identity-reinforcing limitation begins to loosen. Emotion, in this way, becomes a creation tool, not just a reaction. But there is another force at work, one that determines whether this emotional energy will produce consistent results. It is not enough to feel high energy occasionally. Something deeper shapes how that energy flows and compounds over time. Throughout this chapter, we uncovered a powerful truth. Your emotional energy is not incidental. It is not passive. It is not simply how you feel. It is a creation tool. It guides perception, magnifies focus, and amplifies motivation. It shapes which opportunities appear obvious and which remain invisible. When you begin observing it, shaping it, and channeling it deliberately, you are no longer waiting for life to change. You are directing life toward the reality you intend to create. And yet, as important as emotion is, it works in tandem with another principle that determines the scale of your impact. Because emotional energy alone does not guarantee your trajectory. There is another layer, a set of internal standards that shapes whether this energy leads to real, sustainable growth. You've learned how energy amplifies perception, how emotions can create opportunity, how high-energy states begin to reshape identity. Now it's time to uncover the principle that directs all that energy. Without it, momentum can stall. Without it, even high-energy action can drift aimlessly. Chapter 9. The Identity Upgrade Moment. There comes a moment in nearly every life when the familiar path no longer feels like enough. You may recognize it in subtle ways, a lingering dissatisfaction, a sense of restlessness, a quiet awareness that the person you've been up to this point isn't the person you want to become. And then the moment arrives. It can be sudden, like a conversation, a failure, or an opportunity that demands more than the person you were yesterday. Or it can be gradual, a creeping sense that the old routines, the old ways of thinking, the old identity no longer serve you. In that moment, a choice appears. Do you remain who you have always been, repeating the same patterns, anchored to the same familiar self? Or do you step forward, choosing a new identity, a version of yourself that thinks differently, acts differently, and therefore experiences a different reality? This is what I call the identity upgrade moment. It is not about adding new habits or forcing behavior. It is far deeper than that. Habits can help, yes. They are tools. But habits alone will not create transformation if the identity behind them remains unchanged. Transformation occurs when you become a different type of thinker, when the lens through which you see the world evolves. When your identity changes, your decisions, your actions, your perception, and even the opportunities that appear to you begin to shift naturally. And here is a principle to hold on to as you move through this process. Your life expands to match the identity you maintain. Say it quietly to yourself. Let it settle. Notice how that sounds inside you. Your life does not change because of wishful thinking. It changes because the mind begins to embody a new narrative. It changes because the identity you consistently operate from begins to direct your choices. It changes because the reality you experience is drawn to the energy of the self you hold internally. Let's consider a simple scenario. Two people face a similar opportunity. Both want to achieve more, both dream of greater success, but only one will step into the next version of themselves. The first person tries to stretch old habits, forcing change externally while internally holding the same self-belief, the same patterns, the same identity. The second person pauses and asks a different question. If I were already the person I want to become, how would I act right now? It's subtle, but it is profound, because the answer does not come from logic. It comes from imagination, from internal alignment, from stepping into an identity that your mind recognizes as possible. And here is the remarkable truth. The moment you act as that next version of yourself, even imperfectly, your brain begins to update your internal model. The resistance that once felt immovable softens. Opportunities begin to appear that previously went unnoticed. Your energy shifts. Your actions follow. Now let's anchor this into a coaching practice you can do today. Visualize the next version of yourself. Not just the behavior, not just the habit, but the way this version of you thinks. Ask yourself, if I were already that person, what decision would I make today? Notice the subtle shifts in your mind. Notice what becomes clear, what choices suddenly feel aligned, what actions feel inevitable. Then act. Small, deliberate steps in the direction of that identity are far more powerful than hours of self-discipline without internal change. It's important to realize that identity is not static. It is learned. It is reinforced. It can be upgraded repeatedly. This is why the phrase continues to matter. Your life expands to match the identity you maintain. Say it again. Let it sink in. Every choice you make, every thought you nurture, every emotion you carry reinforces a version of yourself. Some choices reinforce the old identity, keeping patterns small, familiar, predictable. Other choices upgrade your identity, expanding your sense of possibility, reshaping your brain, and therefore reshaping your reality. And here's a subtle insight most people miss. The shift is rarely instantaneous. It begins quietly, internally, often unnoticed by the outside world. But internally, the brain is registering each action, each decision, each mental rehearsal as new evidence. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the identity begins to update. Once identity begins to shift, something extraordinary happens. The limitations that once defined possibility begin to fall away. The energy that once felt scattered becomes focused. The decisions that once felt impossible begin to feel natural. The life you've been imagining starts to show up in subtle, undeniable ways. This is the identity upgrade moment in action. It is the threshold between the life you have been living and the life you are ready to create. And as always, there is one final truth to hold. Your identity is your compass. It is your lens. It is the force quietly guiding every action, every decision, every result. The more consciously you upgrade it, the more your life will expand in ways previously unimaginable. You've learned how to notice your patterns, align your thoughts and emotions, and use momentum and confidence to reshape your internal world. Now it's time to see the final step, integration. Because an upgraded identity, once created, must be lived. It is not a theory. It is not a practice you stop doing. It is a way of being. In the next chapter, we will explore how to take all of these lessons, patterns, alignment, momentum, emotional energy, identity upgrades, and weave them into a daily, living practice that transforms your entire experience of reality. Chapter 10, Designing the Reality You Step Into Next. By now, you have traveled through patterns that run your life, the signals your mind broadcasts, the identity your brain protects, the emotional energy you carry, and the moments when you can upgrade yourself. Each chapter has been a piece of the puzzle, a layer of understanding, a tool for transformation. And now, in this final stage, we step into the perspective that changes everything. Life is not a series of random events. It is not something that happens to you because of luck, circumstance, or timing. Life is a continuous process of conscious identity evolution. Every thought you entertain, every emotion you nurture, every decision you make is part of the blueprint for your next reality. And the more intentional you become, the more this blueprint begins to manifest naturally in your daily life. Think about people who consistently live extraordinary lives. Notice something subtle. They don't chase life. They don't react constantly to what happens around them. They design. They see the world through the lens of the identity they maintain, the energy they radiate, and the patterns they consciously cultivate. They don't wait for clarity. They create it. They don't wait for courage. They act in alignment with the person they are becoming. They don't wait for opportunity. They see the possibility in every situation. This is the essence of mastering your thinking. When your mind, your emotions, and your identity align, the life you step into is not something you hope for. It is something that naturally emerges. Let's integrate everything we've learned. Notice how the threads of this audiobook come together. Your life follows the identity you maintain. Your emotions amplify your direction. Awareness interrupts old patterns before they dictate your reality. Small actions and momentum create belief. Alignment allows energy to flow naturally into opportunity. Identity upgrades transform decisions, perception, and results. Each of these principles reinforces the others, creating a self-sustaining loop of transformation. Pause for a moment and imagine this as a living system. Your daily thoughts, actions, and emotions are no longer random. They are signals, patterns, and energy flowing in the direction of your designed reality. When this happens, you begin to realize something profound. You are not chasing a new reality. You are becoming the person who naturally lives it. Now, let's take a practical moment of reflection. Ask yourself, what version of yourself do you want to live as tomorrow? What decisions would that person make, even in small ways, right now? What patterns would they reinforce? What energy would they carry? And then commit. Even one intentional choice, made consistently, begins to shift the trajectory of your life. One deliberate alignment, repeated over days and weeks, becomes a new default. One upgraded identity, lived daily, begins to shape every perception, every interaction, every opportunity. This is the power of designing your reality. It is not about forcing external circumstances to change. It is about changing the internal architecture of your mind, your emotions, your identity, and your patterns. When that internal system changes, the external world naturally rearranges itself to match. And the final insight, the one that ties the entire journey together, is this. Transformation is not something you do. It is something you become. Your life does not transform because of effort alone. It transforms because you upgrade the person you are, and the life expands to fit that person. So here is the challenge. Start today. Not tomorrow. Not when conditions feel perfect. Step fully into the identity of the person you want to be. Act as though your upgraded self is already present. Observe your energy, align your actions, and let your emotions amplify the direction you are moving. Notice patterns, interrupt those that no longer serve you, and repeat the loop consciously every day. The life you have imagined is already possible. The identity you need already exists within you. The only missing piece is the consistent, deliberate choice to become that person in every moment. And as you do this, you will notice something extraordinary. The reality you step into tomorrow is not a distant dream. It is the natural extension of the person you choose to be today. You have designed the path. You have built the tools. You have understood the mechanism. Now live it. Now step into it. Now become the person who does not wait for life, but creates it moment by moment. This is your life expanded. This is your reality redesigned. This is the person you are becoming. In closing, before you move on with your day, pause for a moment, because if you've really listened to what we explored together, something inside you is already different. Not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly. You're starting to see things you couldn't see before. You're starting to notice your thoughts, instead of automatically believing them. You're starting to recognize patterns, instead of repeating them unconsciously. And this is where the real shift begins. Not when motivation is high, not when everything feels perfect, but in the ordinary moments that follow this one. The moment you hesitate and notice the hesitation. The moment fear appears and you recognize it as a familiar program. The moment your mind suggests the same old story. And something inside you responds differently. Because here's the deeper truth. Your life will not change because you listen to this audiobook. Your life changes when you begin seeing yourself differently. When the person inside your mind begins evolving. When the identity you protect becomes larger than the identity you used to defend. And that shift doesn't happen once. It happens again, and again, and again, until one day you look around your life and realize something remarkable. The person you used to be no longer fits here. Not your thinking, not your behavior, not your future. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped trying to change your life. and started becoming the person who naturally lives a different one. So here's the only challenge that matters now. Over the next few days, watch your own mind. Watch how it reacts. Watch what it assumes. Watch what it resists. Not with judgment, with curiosity. Because the moment you can see a pattern, you are no longer trapped inside it. And that simple awareness is where every transformation begins. The shift has already started. Now the question is, how far are you willing to take it?